Welcome, everyone, to our third session of day 3 of Washington Arbitration Week 2025. This is our 6th edition, and Crowell Mooring has been a sponsor and supporter since the beginning, and we're very pleased to host this session today. My name is Ian Laird. I'm not only your host, but am moderating our noontime panel, which we've titled a book launch, and I'll get more into that. But the official title is Canada's Place in the World and Vis-a-vis the US, discussion with H. Scott Fairley, author of Foreign Affairs in the Canadian Constitution and the Canadian in the Canadian Constitution. So I got a copy of the book. It's fresh off the press, I think, just in the last few weeks. So these are early copies. I'm going to do the advertisement up front. We actually weren't able to procure enough printed copies for this event, but it's, of course, you're able to order it online from the publisher. So it is available. And we do have flyers up front here for those who need a little bit of paper to help remind them if you're so inclined to purchase a copy of this book. Hopefully our discussion at lunch today will motivate you to want to dig deeper into some of the issues we're going to talk about. It's a real pleasure today to have with me Scott Fairley, Dr. Scott Fairley, I think would be fair, Professor Scott Fairley in many instances. Scott, and the way I describe Scott to folks when they say, you know, who is Scott Fairley? This is to my of course, lawyer and international law friends. I say Scott is the Dean of International Law in Canada. And I don't say that lightly because you know, obviously there's a very long and deep tradition of international law in Canada. Canada has had great diplomats and world leaders, you know, going back even to the beginning of the country. Canada was always very situated in whatever the geopolitical environment was, and in particular, that environment as it involved the United States. And I think we're going to get into some of those issues. But Scott's involvement is not only one as a scholar and as a practitioner and, you know, as continuing to be an active counsel and lawyer and arbitrator, but Scott has really lived through much of the most recent history involving Canada's progression in the international law world. And just to give you a bit of an anecdote, after law school, we have the first year for a new lawyer after law school is not becoming a lawyer like you do in the US. You have to do something called articles. And that's basically a one-year job interview, which sounds terrifying, and it is, because there's no guarantee that you'll be hired back at the end of the articles. But after you do your you know, essentially practice year, you then get hired by either your firm or you go off and do your own thing. When I was interviewing for articles, I actually interviewed with Scott. I don't know if you remember this, and we haven't talked about this.
No, we have not.
But the reason why I picked his firm and Scott in particular was that he actually was one of those rare, and I say brave, practitioners in Toronto who put in his CV that he practiced international law. Now, this is a rather, I think, daring thing for the time, because that's very unusual. Yes, no, we're talking, 35 years ago. So I'm really dating myself. You know, you just do the math. But
and I was a very young lawyer.
And at the time, you know, I think, yes, Scott was, of course, just a young associate, of course. But it was a very attractive idea. And, you know, I'm sorry we didn't end up working together way back then, but Scott has continued to have a stellar career in international law. And we'll talk a bit more about his book, but just to give you a background of some of his credentials, He is currently a partner at Cambridge LLP in Toronto. He is a Queen's University law grad, as well as having an LLM from NYU in International Legal Studies. And he did his doctorate, SJD, at Harvard in International and Constitutional Law. So very apropos to the book that we're going to talk about today. He's a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators and is, of course, as I am, a member of the Ontario Bar, which is a very high and rare honor for those of the 20,000 some odd lawyers in Ontario. Scott has always been a big supporter of whatever international law activities have been going on in Canada. He's had leadership capacities in the Bar Association and the Canadian Council on International Law, and as well as in the International Law section of the American Bar Association. He is being counsel as well and an arbitrator in numerous cases, and as litigation experience at all levels of court, including the Supreme Court of Canada. In fact, Scott is a founding director of the Canadian branch of the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators and works in that capacity as well. So we have someone here who has worked in the community, thought deeply about international law issues, but has always come at it from a uniquely Canadian angle. And certainly the constitutional background is one that goes back to your academic days. And I think really your latest book is an outgrowth of that. But maybe before we kind of get into the book and talk about some of the interesting details of that, I'll ask Scott to kind of give us some preliminary comments, and that will kind of spur us on to a more conversational kind of engagement. So Scott, why don't I pass it off to you and we'll get going.
Thanks very much, Ian. First, for your most gracious and I have to say embellished introduction. I'm a little embarrassed by that, but also extremely grateful for it. And also to Crowell for hosting this event, which Ian stepped up to organize and initiated, for which I am extremely appreciative. And to you, the audience, for hanging in to listen to what I have to say about a relationship between two countries that, notwithstanding the current atmosphere, I shall put it, is inextricably intertwined. Inextricably intertwined, which cannot be unraveled by any government, at least not very quickly, as much as you kind of read about that in the headlines. As to the book, it's something that has been in gestation for a long time. So as Ian mentioned, I've lived through a lot of this stuff, participated in treaty negotiations, argued some cases in relation to the themes presented in the book. And so there's a personal element to it, as well as sort of like the scholarly dissection of a subject. So I'll just say that. My publisher tells me that from inception at the contract to the manuscript, I've established a record in terms of time that is never likely to be broken. We're talking about, in terms of thought, several decades. In terms of serious writing, 5 or 6 years, dating from that contract. I think it's even older than that. I think we're looking at, 2008. So they were very happy to dust off the contract and proceed with this. And, we now have a tangible result. A very dear friend and former colleague in academia, where I began my professional career. You know, when I was saying, gee, you know, it's taken so long. And he said, well, it was a little bit an encouraging comment. He said that the time for the book has come. And so maybe that's just coincidence or dumb luck, whatever it is. It's kind of an essential element of what inspired Ian to say it was worthwhile to speak to an audience here during Washington Arbitration Week. Who would have thought? Not me, certainly, until Ian suggested it, which was, you know, absolutely great. In terms of the gestation, for those of you who ever take a look at the book, it's dedicated to 3 of my teachers and subsequent mentors, none of whom is dedicated to their memory. None of them are currently around. But Abram Chase at Harvard, who shepherded the thesis, and there's vestiges of that in this. Vestiges, but you know, not a lot, since everything has sort of moved on since then and was incorporated in the subject. He was legal advisor to President Kennedy, an amazing guy. And I fondly remember sessions where he read each chapter of the thing way back when the earth was cooling in his black vinyl armchair in Griswold 404, where the stuffing was coming out of the arms. But anyway, prior to him, Tom Frank at NYU, who is an expat Canadian, originally a refugee from Berlin, who managed to get off the boat before World War II in Vancouver, grew up there, became a Canadian, and then became essentially the engine of the international law program at NYU, which is now, you know, certainly one of, if not the most comprehensive in this country. And then lastly, Ron Watts, who is principal at Queen's, whose secretary typed my papers for me when he was dean of arts and science, and subsequently as principal. He directed me laterally many years after I left Queen's on the international dialogue on federalism, in which Canada was a part. And so I just wanted to mention that in terms of the gestation period. And while the topic of this book is clearly Canadian, it has a strong American connection, both in terms of how the country was formed, which we'll get to, and also in terms of inspiration. And here, and it's quite clear in the book, it comes up several times at the beginning and again at the end. I refer to what James Madison proclaimed in the Federalist number 42, back in the year of our Lord, 1788. And he said, it's just a one-liner, but if you're going to be a nation in any respect, it must be with other nations. And that was a message which was incorporated in the US Constitution that Madison largely drafted, and that you still have now, where foreign affairs, the conduct of relations between states in terms of treaties and so forth, is clearly ensconced at the federal level as between the president and Congress. Now, I appreciate that current history has put some stress on how those powers were initially separated when we start talking about executive agreements and stuff like that, but it's there. And while we will get to it, it was nowhere in the Canadian Constitution as originally drafted in 1867, but I will revisit that. The message of the book, which we'll elaborate on, is while a written constitution didn't have anything to say about it, history, precedent, the expansion of judicial review has kind of caught up, and foreign affairs is within the four corners of the Canadian Constitution, hence the title of the book, Foreign Affairs in the Canadian Constitution, as opposed to and. My originally proposed title was The Making of a Foreign Affairs Power, but the publisher didn't like that. It was too long. So that's what you've got with this. Ian, back to you.
Well, I mean, you've raised a couple of important issues, and it just makes me think, you know, as a Canadian sitting here in Washington in this current political environment, where in Canada, you know, we talked about this, the big issue of the day, and this may be news to many of you, is the concern about annexation, about the repeated digs and responses and statements from the current president that Canada is destined to be the 51st US state. Now, some folks may take that as just Trump being Trump and as a joke, but Canadians take that incredibly seriously. It is existential. And to some extent, that existential moment that we're living in is kind of the point of the spear of this book in many ways, because Canadians, you might think, are a nice, well-organized people, kind of the Swiss of North America, you know, get along well and all those positive things. But when you cut below the surface, and particularly when we're talking about the constitutional makeup of Canada and how, you know, constitutional powers are divided, Canada's had a bit of a rough ride, and the actual idea of foreign affairs in the Canadian Constitution has a little bit more contentiousness than an outsider would actually appreciate. Canada is, and I'll make this statement as a former poli-sci student who's spent a lot of time studying the Canadian political setup, as well as, you know, the US government and how it operates from a legal and political point of view. But Canada is probably one of the most decentralized federal states in the world. And many people would not think, looking at Canada, that would be the case. But that is the structure that was created largely in 1867 when Canada was, you know, was founded as the Dominion of Canada. And that's really the beginning of the story of why this idea of a foreign affairs power in the Canadian Constitution residing at the federal level is actually much more contentious than one would think. One would think that's kind of a natural place, like, well, who else would have the foreign affairs power? But in a highly decentralized federal state, this raises a lot of issues and is, in fact, being the root of a lot of very important and consequential cases before the Supreme Court of Canada. It has worked through a lot of you know, self-reflection going back to the 1980s about, and this specifically relates to the topic of our previous panel, is, you know, should Canada have free trade with the United States? And that power, that foreign affairs power, and the ability of the federal government to actually enter into that first Canada-US free trade agreement was a live issue in Canada. Not only were Canadians thinking hard in the mid-1980s about, do we want to become closer to the behemoth below us, south of us, from an economic point of view? How is this going to impact our independence as a country? Like, how does that impact our view as a sovereign nation? So Canada's and Canadians, and in particular, my friend here, have spent a lot of time navel gazing on this specific topic because it is so directly relevant to being a Canadian in so many ways. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the history, because I think when you go back to 1867, where Canada was, why it became a country, and how that actually relates to our relationship with the United States, I think that's an excellent starting point from not only a historical point of view, but from a constitutional point of view. So could you talk a little bit about that historical development? Because I know that's an important part of your book, and those of you who want to dive deep, you can get it in the book, but Scott can give us kind of the headlines.
Okay, back to square one, which isn't exactly square one, but 1867. Canada was at that point in time, or a couple of years before, still an amalgam of separate self-governing dominions, if you will. There was the older provinces in the east, Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. Newfoundland was still part of the British Empire, completely not affiliated with Canada. Then there was Upper and Lower Canada that previously had had a united government for a while. And then it was going to split up again under Confederation. Confederation is a bit of a misnomer because I'm going to push back a bit on Ian's view of Canada as being the most decentralized federation around. And that's a message that provincial premiers continually communicate in visits to this city. Danielle Smith from Alberta probably being the most notorious in recent months. Rob Ford more benignly on behalf of Ontario, being more in line with Prime Minister Carney and the Canadian ambassador to Washington's representations here on behalf of the country as a whole. But going back to square one, 1867, it was at perhaps first instance, or at least competitively, a desire of the Canadian provinces, all but Nova Scotia for a while, to band together to resist American expansionism. And the major fear at that point in time was an unemployed Union Army, fresh from its victory against the South. And what were they going to do? That was, going back to the Charlottetown Conference in 1865, that was a big issue. Now, luckily for us, the United States was somewhat exhausted from that ordeal, and they disbanded that huge army not long after Appomattox. So there was some relief in that, but it was a catalyst. The Americans were coming. They'd come twice before. 1775, even before the United States was the United States, an embryonic Congress authorized an invasion of Canada. And they didn't organize it very well. They hired bad generals. Richard Montgomery got himself shot in the middle of the night trying to take Quebec. They did take Montreal, but gave it back. And then in the spring of 1775, gentleman Johnny Burgoyne with a large British army came up the St. Lawrence and then pushed down through the Finger Lakes. And that was the beginning of the Revolutionary War. Scroll forward, James Madison, a guy who's a real friend of mine for purposes of this book, 1812, he invades Canada as really because of beefs he had with Great Britain, involving trade between the United States and the rest of the world, and various British Empire insults to the United States, like stopping American ships and using that as an opportunity to take off deserters, many of whom were actually Americans. Well, okay, I've got a commentator here. So anyway, there's a bunch of grievances, and they figured that Canada was easy pickings. Again, not such a good result. But there's a Canadian historian, Wesley Turner, who's written a very interesting little book for those of you who are interested, since the War of 1812 was taught very differently on both sides of the border, but it's essentially a war that both sides won. That's really the message that comes out of that, because while the Battle of New Orleans might have blunted what was otherwise a pretty clear British-Canadian victory, particularly after this is a piece of history you may or may not know about, but the White House is white, courtesy of the British Army, which burned Washington in 1814. And they painted it white afterwards to cover up the scorch marks. Madison deserted the city and never lived in the White House that he was supervising the construction of before he left office.
I think Dolly Madison famously rescued all the paintings in a
that
cart.
was really interesting. So the Americans have tried twice to take us out, and that really didn't work, and kind of galvanized the country in some ways, like it's being galvanized now with talks of annexation and so on and so forth. Now to the foreign affairs piece. Now the other part of Confederation was really, okay, Sir John Macdonald, our founding father, the closest thing we've got to, he's sort of like George Washington, James Madison, and with a soupçon of Tom Jefferson, only a soupçon, put together. His vision of Canada was what drove Confederation, and resisting the United States was, and bringing everybody together to do that was one theme. The other was Western expansion, which resulted in the 49th parallel, all the way to the West Coast, with a few boundary disputes in between. And I think the current president has even brought into question the 49th parallel in one of his op-eds.
It's apparently just a line.
Apparently it's just a line. Anyway, we're going to adhere to that line. And so from the outset, Canada was an answer to the US. Our Constitution was the original intent behind it was to avoid the pitfalls of the US, which had resulted in the Canadian view of at the time in an incredibly destructive civil war, which has haunted this nation ever since. And so central power, residual power under the Canadian Constitution doesn't belong to the states like it does here. It belongs to the federal government. And that's a critical aspect of the book. Residual power for and I'm using the language, the peace, order, and good government of the nation. So that was the original intent. When you look back at the US, Tom Jefferson had a big influence on James Madison. Residual states' rights was a big thing at the outset, but it kind of got reversed in the US, in large part through the courts. John Marshall, and one case after another, after Marbury and Madison, which established that the courts were going to be the final interpreter of what the US Constitution said, not the president. And that's what that case was about. It was Jefferson's attempt to muscle out the courts in terms of what he thought his power was as president. He lost that case. And Marshall soldiered on, as did many of his successors. The Interstate Commerce Clause became an engine of national unity. Okay, what happened in Canada? The counterpart is Section 91(2) of the Constitution Act 1867. Parliament shall have regulation over trade connecting the provinces or the outside, and general trade and commerce. That provision, which was the engine of the generality of it, which was the engine of the Interstate Commerce Clause down here, was totally ignored by the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, which was the final court of appeal for Canada until 1949, and the Supreme Court of Canada until more recent years was largely a disciple of, or deferred to what the Privy Council had said initially, but in the last 30 years, the Supreme Court of Canada has been clawing back big time, which with the securities reference of 2018, essentially said, Canada can have a national securities regulator. It doesn't seem to be germane to this topic of this book, but it is, in terms of the federal government finally getting its due for jurisdiction in the national interest. Foreign affairs, not part of the original deal. Back in 1867, Canada remained a dominion within the British Empire. And however, again, the book has some history, has the history in there. It was kind of an uneasy relationship in that Canada viewed itself increasingly as an autonomous actor. Okay, there was attempts at various points to carve that out in the courts, which prior to the 1930s wasn't all that successful. But World War I was a crucible, and Canada got fed up as the senior dominion, having its men fed as cannon fodder into a badly administered British campaign on the Western Front. Whole villages were wiped out. Casualties in Canada were, while the US came into the war relatively late, casualties in Canada were 10 or 15 times US casualties with respect to participation in World War I. And Canada communicated to the United Kingdom that we're not going to be thrown around like this anymore, and we are going to have a major role in the international commitments we make. So that World War I, immediately Canada's in as a member of the British Empire. World War II, no. We didn't declare war against Germany until a week after the Brits were into it, after a parliamentary resolution. In between, Canada's gradually said, you know what, we should be conducting our own foreign affairs. Fun fact, the first treaty negotiated by Canada was with this country, the United States of America, in 1923. The Halibut Treaty, just for the halibut. And that treaty, the Northwest Pacific Halibut Treaty, is still good law between our two countries. It's had a much longer history as USMCA and may indeed outlive it. And it's the reason why you can eat quality fish and chips today. So that was the first treaty Canada did on its own. And the Colonial Office was really pissed off. They said,
This is in London.
This is in London, yeah. What the hell are you doing? It's the British Empire. And Canada said, well, no, not really, not anymore. And so the I's were dotted and the T's were crossed in the Statute of Westminster, 1930, which essentially gave up. It was essentially the beginning or almost the end of the dissolution of the British Empire into the British Commonwealth. And other vestiges of the colonial connection were divested thereafter. I mentioned treaties to the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, or cases going to the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council until 1949. After that, the Supreme Court of Canada is the last word.
So
It's criminal cases.
A little bit earlier on. Well, yeah.
So Scott, we kind of have this interesting dynamic of Canada's, I guess, incremental evolution of independence from the empire. You know, the Americans had a short little war for their independence, but interestingly, the Canadians, which I think is true to form, it took 70 years for them to get their international true independence from the empire. With, I guess, the Statute of Westminster would be the key point in 1931, although this was an evolution. Let's fast forward again to the 1980s. We have, as you've set out, nothing written about foreign affairs in the Canadian Constitution. We have a Constitution Act, but it's a pretty light document for the most part. It has the division of powers. The provinces have most of the powers, but as you said, the federal government plays an important role in the Confederation in terms of trade, and particularly the outward-looking function. It has the primary role, but foreign affairs itself continues to be a question. So we'll fast forward to the 1980s. What happened that was consequential at that time? And I think for students of Canada and you know, looking at that time, we were in a state where we almost split up as a country. There were a number of referenda in that period. Quebec was in a grumpy mood about its place in Confederation. What happened then?
Well, there was a huge royal commission. Canada loves royal commissions, which is essentially a device for tabling issues into exercises in many words, published in many volumes, or at least big volumes. And there was a particular, the Royal Commission on Canada's Economic Future, chaired by the Honorable Donald MacDonald in the 1980s, essentially came to the conclusion, after 63 volumes of studies and a 3-volume report, that Canada's future was inextricably linked with and could positively benefit from a closer working relationship with the United States. Now, in coming to that conclusion, they were at odds with only a few provinces: Ontario, Alberta, and I believe Saskatchewan. Those 3 provinces were very vocal in saying, you cannot do this. It breaks up the East-West paradigm of Canada that was established as the buttress to the United States, that it would also result in a cultural invasion we couldn't recover from, as well as economic dependence, and so forth. They threatened a constitutional challenge. The basis for that constitutional challenge goes back to the history of foreign affairs to date. And that history was that the feds had control and were the treaty makers. But case law had heretofore limited their ability to implement that treaty obligation, conditional upon the federal division of powers that Ian mentioned. Now, the federal list is actually longer than the provincial list. So I think Ian and I don't quite agree on how decentralized things are. But there was a case in 1937 called the Labor Conventions case, where an unenlightened law lord said there's no such thing as treaty legislation as such. So the counterpart to Canada's foreign policy, that is the companion to making a treaty and following through with it, were bisected, which is where the provinces said they had all their leverage. And they said the proposed Canada-US Free Trade Agreement was something that severely impacted provincial heads of power. Property and civil rights in the province was a big one. Matters of more obtuse, matters of a local and private nature in the province. That was another one. And so they said, you can't do this unless we agree. And by the way, we don't agree. There was a huge debate about it. I was involved in that as a former academic and a young lawyer hunting for clients. And the margins, the question was, well, what are the Fed's margin for error here? And it was getting play in the United States, saying, okay, well, who are we negotiating with actually? And can the Feds do this? Now, what the federal government ended up doing, or Parliament ended up doing, was and this is something I argued for in Senate and House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee hearings. Narrow your target. If you're too comprehensive and you're implementing legislation, you're going to give the provinces targets to attack in the legislation. So what you've got is a very short statute that essentially says, you know, Canada's on board with this. And if there's anything that needs to be done to maintain the agreement, then Parliament will enact further legislation to do that. But there was no target. And I don't know what the individual lawyers in the various AG departments in those provinces, what their thinking was, but the point is they choked. They didn't do it. Now scrolling forward to the issue of climate change, which Canada seesawed on between the Trudeau government, the Harper government, and the current government of Canada. That is to say, Canada's participation in the Paris Accords and meeting carbon emission reduction targets. We got back on board with Paris and Kyoto, and then there was a lot of federal provincial negotiation as to what individual provinces could live with in terms of carbon emissions and how it could be covered, economic impacts. Alberta being front and center in that regard with respect to its oil production, oil sands in particular, which are dirtier than most, but can't be scrubbed out. And here, those negotiations ultimately failed, at least to the satisfaction of three provinces again: Ontario, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. And the other provinces, notably, really interesting point here, province of Quebec has been on board with federal international initiatives throughout. There was a little war going back, which the Minister of Foreign Affairs at the time, Mitchell Sharp, in his memoir called The Battle of the Flags, which the feds won. But Quebec, for a time, this was something embraced in a provincial separatist academic who was also a member of the Quebec legislature. His name was Guérin Laurgeois. And his doctrine was, okay, we can reverse engineer the Canadian Constitution in terms of foreign relations, saying, okay, if you've got primary, virtually exclusive jurisdiction in a particular field, like education, then you should be able to translate that legislative supremacy into executive power to negotiate treaties on point. And that was something that was debated primarily in an association of Francophone nations called the Francophone Summit. And there was political accommodations with respect to that ultimately, but the federal government never gave up, and Quebec relinquished its campaign on hegemony in international negotiations, although they're there. And there's a lot of federal provincial compromise in Canadian delegations for treaty negotiation. But they've handled it quite well. I was involved in one of those, not a big treaty, 10 years in The Hague. Those who make treaties, it's like sausage. You know, those who like it don't want to know how it came about. But there was provincial participation in that, but at all points, the feds were in control and led the delegation, but you know, had their ears attuned to what the provincial concerns were. So back to the climate change thing, what's different between free trade and protecting the environment is the provinces pulled the trigger. In individual references in each of the three provinces, the Ontario Court of Appeal booted Ontario in its objections to the carbon reduction legislation. Saskatchewan, the same. Alberta, no. For those of you, it's not something that happens in the US, because in the United States, the US Supreme Court only has jurisdiction over quote unquote cases and controversies. In Canada, every province and the federal government can refer questions to their courts. In Canada's case, it goes directly to the Supreme Court of Canada. Provincial case, it goes to the Court of Appeal for the given province, and then they have an automatic right of appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada, which is what happened in this case. And the Supreme Court of Canada in the consolidated reference blew out Alberta and affirmed Ontario and the Saskatchewan courts. There's an important message in that case where the judges in two of the three provincial courts, and again in the Supreme Court of Canada, focused on the treaty component and said that they don't go as far as I do. The third to last chapter of the book takes that on, and I reform the test a bit, extending it a bit. Supreme Court of Canada hasn't gone as far as I have in the argument presented in this book, but they're not far behind. And so the treaty became an integral component, that is the international obligation, and how that informed what had to happen domestically, that moves the needle on the treaty implementation defense of the province. It's a narrow one. It's not carte blanche whatsoever. And the message of this book certainly isn't to drive in a cart and a horse through legitimate provincial jurisdiction. What it is intended to do is stop or give an answer to discordant messages from our country to other countries, in particular this one, in the world we're facing now. And so I argue that, at least in these limited circumstances where the international obligation to a large extent informs, if not governing outright, what the domestic legislative prescription should be, that there is treaty legislation as such within those parameters. And that's the ultimate message of the book. And the last line is the feds have got the power if they choose to exercise it carefully and responsibly. And they got to do it now. And with that, I would just mention Bill C-5, which the Carney government pushed through Parliament, even though they're in a minority. Well, they're in this squeaky majority situation with one seat now.
Mhm.
And that piece of legislation basically authorizes the pursuit of huge national projects, almost like Roosevelt's New Deal in the 1930s, to bring the country together and project outward with new relationships that would reduce our dependence on the United States without ignoring it. As I began my remarks, there's no unraveling of this. And it would be a shame if it did unravel, because it's mutually beneficial to both countries. And North America, I think, if it can pull together, as opposed to split up or become a I don't know, an annexation controversy, if you will. We're probably best situated in the whole face of the planet to resist the challenges that are kind of all around us. So that goes to the timing of the message of this. And our constitutional histories are really interesting. When you look at it, the United States started off with a decentralized model and the court took it elsewhere. We started off with a centralized model and went the other way. The histories of our two countries constitutionally are like this.
Well, and I think the interesting part of that is that Canadian scholars and politicians, and this goes back to the Confederation in 1867, Canadians were very mindful of what was going on in the US. Like, they followed it closely. They were scholars of American constitutional law and history, but I can't say it's been working back the other way. So I'm hoping that this discussion will help give some more context, both for our American colleagues, but also help our Canadian colleagues in the legal and constitutional community kind of understand where we are on this question. And let me just finish off on a final point. You recently wrote an opinion editorial, an op-ed for Canada's one of Canada's big newspapers, the Globe and Mail, talking about many of these issues because it's a very timely. It's always very timely to talk about federal-provincial relations and where Canada fits into that current, and particularly in this current trade environment, geopolitical environment. The idea that Canada speaks for Canada would seem obvious to the outside world, but still is a question in Canada. And this book is an example of trying to contribute to that dialogue. But in your op-ed, it's actually titled "Who Speaks for Canada?" So obviously you're considering it a bit of an open question still, but to kind of balance out a bit of, and I think this is in your book as well, but maybe give you a chance to finish off on the related thing. You say in your op-ed, none of what I've said, and basically very similar to what we've just heard and talked about, should suggest that provincial powers do not remain robust in their own sphere. And, can you expand a little bit on that and kind of give us your thoughts? Because obviously there's still this balance going on in Canada, and the fact that we've evolved, again, a long time in coming, evolved to where we are in terms of the foreign affairs power. How is that working in the modern context on the federal provincial angle, and then from an out-facing point of view?
Okay.
I know that's a lot.
Yeah, I've got copies of the op-ed here for any of you who are interested, and you can read it in chapter and verse. Essentially, I think that the point is what Canadian provinces are better off doing and what the country is better off with in the result is that their basic economic, political, social concerns be conveyed very clearly to the federal government, and the channels of communication in Ottawa have to be very open to that and attuned to that. And that's where the provinces should channel their concerns when dealing with a foreign nation. Example of what in the op-ed I say was the right way of doing it. Premier Scott Moe of Saskatchewan, and keeping in mind they were one of the challengers to the climate change thing. But the Premier Moe is kind of, he smelled the coffee. And so what does he say? He's confronted with a bellicose China that imposes massive tariffs on a major Saskatchewan export, canola seeds and canola oil. This is a big deal, which is going to hurt the Saskatchewan economy, and more to the point, a lot of Saskatchewan farmers, like really seriously. What does he do? He says, the Prime Minister has to get us out of this. And that's how it's played in the media. And he goes to Ottawa. He also goes to China, but he doesn't meet with the Premier of China. It's essentially a goodwill mission to say, look, this isn't good for you. What the Chinese government is doing isn't good for China or us. And he's saying that Prime Minister Carney is going to follow up. That is constructive representation of provincial interests on the international stage. Okay, what isn't good? Premier Daniel Smith of Alberta, who has major concerns about Alberta's future, largely because of the failure of previous federal governments to facilitate Alberta's access to international markets and its resulting dependence on the US market for, in particular, its oil. She doesn't go through Ottawa. She marches down to Washington on her own, trying to chat up your president. And to the best of my knowledge, there was no really chummy interchange between Premier Smith, which was somewhat embarrassing to her, and the President of the United States. But that was a discordant distraction that shouldn't be there, that undermines a comprehensive, a sort of a unified Canadian response to the tariff war, related national security and energy concerns, and a whole mess of things that tie our countries together. The Premier of Ontario, Rob Ford, he's more benign, since he's kind of, thus far, the Ontario economy, particularly because of the automobile industry, is aligned with the government in Ottawa, or so far the government in Ottawa. Prime Minister Carney is extremely mindful of Ontario's interest as the largest economic engine in the country. But he was down there as well, down here. Not there, we're here. Down here as well, having his own discussions. And again, that's a point of confusion. It's not something that the US federal government ever entertains. The example that I can cite, which is, really quite extraordinary from a Canadian point of view, is the White House has managed to systematically ignore the protestations of the government of California on what's happening between our two countries in terms of tariffs and economic relationships. Governor Whitmer in Michigan is another example, but California on its own is the 4th or 5th largest economy on the planet. And the White House doesn't need to pay any attention to it. In Canada, that's an extraordinary proposition, ignoring that big a chunk of your nation. But that shows that that's where, Ian's comment about decentralization versus centralization comes into it. But for Canada now, it cannot afford these kinds of distractions. And the courts in Canada, the Supreme Court of Canada in particular, has kind of shored up the federal position. The climate change case being perhaps the capstone to that. But another thing which I didn't mention, and it was one reason why the foreign affairs power per se has not been clearly recognized until recently, is treaties were, under the parliamentary system inherited from the UK, were an element of the royal prerogative. And that meant it was a governmental prerogative that was totally insulated from judicial review. No judicial accountability. So if you're talking about a power within the Constitution, you've got to be constitutionally accountable for the exercise of that power. And so there was a good argument that is certainly on the treaty making versus treaty implementation dichotomy, that the Fed shouldn't have a clear run. Now, what changed in the 1980s, around the same time as the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement was negotiated, was the royal prerogative was no longer insulated from judicial review. There was a case in the UK, the GCHQ case, which changed that for the Brits, even though, from a kind of a they don't, from a separation of powers perspective. And in Canada, in 1985, it was the Operation Dismantle case, rather innocuous case involving a protest by a number of NGOs to Canada's authorization of US cruise missile testing in Canadian airspace. And that the Supreme Court of Canada assumed jurisdiction over that. Scroll forward, decade and a half later, no, 2.5 decades later, you have the Cotter case. I don't know if any of you have heard about that, but that involved the incarceration of a Canadian miner, Omar Khadr, in Guantanamo after allegedly tossing a grenade at and killing a US Marine in, where was it, Iraq?
Afghanistan.
Afghanistan. And so the question was, did the Canadian government have any obligation to its citizen incarcerated in Guantanamo? Royal prerogative issue. The answer for the Supreme Court was yes, it did. That Canada's first family of terrorism did have constitutional rights. But they didn't say, they didn't prescribe to the government of the day, Stephen Harper, the Harper government, what they should actually do. They just said they have a constitutional obligation to respect this guy's rights. But when you bring the royal prerogative into the constitutional fold and make it accountable, that also makes it that also brings it within the four corners of the Constitution. So that's a subsidiary message in the book that kind of, kind of builds the narrative. And in closing, I guess all I'd like to say is it's somewhat embarrassing to have a book launch without any books. But the University of Chicago Press, which is the distributor for the book in this country, in its failure to get a bookseller to come here today, it's giving you a 40% discount on the book. So, maybe that's even better. So,
well, let me take the opportunity to thank you, Scott. We only touched the very surface of your book. You go into detail on many of the court cases and others that you've alluded to in your discussion today, as well as looked into the kind of public international legal principles that underlie the foreign affairs element of the Constitution. But I think this book has made an incredible contribution to the field, and certainly for the audience here at Washington Arbitration Week, I think it really provides a bit of an insight into a lot of the other issues that we've been talking about from an international arbitration and international law point of view, and even our previous panel where we were doing some navel gazing at past developments of NAFTA and what the future free trade area looks like in North America and Canada's role in that. And so when you see Canada, and this is for our audience, being a part of a negotiation like we're going to see next summer, be very conscious that there is a lot of, it's like a duck on a pond. They're treading fiercely under the water, even though they look very calm on top. And that federal provincial dynamic in Canada certainly makes Canada, I think you'll agree with me, one of the most dynamic federal jurisdictions in the world in terms of how the provinces and the federal government interact on a constitutional level. And that continues to evolve. And we've seen a reflection of that in your book. So I just wanted to thank you very much, Scott, for spending time with us today. And I look forward to talking more about this great book. So thank you very much.